Hello and welcome to the Disability Resource Center's presentation, ADA and Section 504 Accommodations, Equitable Access and Legal Considerations. My name is Amy Goad. I'm the Assistant Director at the Disability Resource Center, and I'm joined by Danielle Johnson, one of our lead access specialists. And Danielle's gonna start us off here. Danielle?
All right, cool. So hi, everyone. Like Amy said, my name is Danielle. I'm sure I've interacted with at least some of you via email or on the phone or in meetings. So basically our mission is to create access on campus. So our actual mission statement, as it's listed here, is to cultivate an accessible university community where students with disabilities have an equal opportunity to fully participate in all aspects of the educational environment. So our purpose through the DRC obviously is to create, an equitable setting both in the classroom and physically on campus. Basically anywhere where student life touches, we're going to try to be present and create access in those spaces. So our goal is to promote student learning and success through partnerships with students, obviously, but also with faculty and staff, because obviously with accommodations, if we don't align with faculty and staff, then oftentimes we can't actually accommodate students if we're not working together. And then I didn't know, Amy, do you want me to describe the picture? I'm sure many of you have seen this picture before. So it's a great representation of, equity versus equality. So in that first picture, it's an example of equality. All the people are getting exactly the same thing. They have the equal size box. But, for these people, obviously it's not going to work for all of them because their heights vary quite significantly. So the second picture is an example of equity where they're all given sort of what they need in order to be able to see the field. So that means that the shortest person is receiving a couple of boxes, the middle-sized person is receiving one box, and that's kind of like how we do test time. Like some students might be able to test in the standard time frame, some students might need time and a half, some students might need double time. And then that third example is a good example of universal design, where everybody's receiving the same thing, but it's created in such a way that it actually is meeting the needs of all people. So really the goal with, any kind of disability access is ultimately universal design and sort of creating spaces where everybody can have equal access, equitable access without needing to do things differentially. But oftentimes it can take time to get to that, place where we're able to have universal design working well. So.
And I'm trying to move it to the next screen.
Okay.
There we go.
No worries.
Okay, so then this next slide is about DRC registration by disability type. Last winter, 2020, we had approximately 2,245 students who were active with us. That includes students who may have a temporary disability, so they may come to us at some point in the quarter and then leave if they no longer need accommodations. Just want to point out that psychological disabilities, which also includes ADHD, make up over half of the students we serve. So most of the students who we serve have non-visible disabilities. And then the rest of the students are broken out here. Again, most non-visible disabilities, learning disabilities, many health disabilities also are not visible. And because of our campus, sometimes students need accommodations when they otherwise wouldn't have needed. So our very hilly campus and the distance between dorms and campus core can create a situation where then students do need to register with us to receive maybe transportation service, things like that. So given our number, that means we serve about 10% of the population of Cal Poly. Often we're asked how that compares nationally. So there was a national study done with a site at the bottom of this slide, and they found that 19% of undergraduate students did self-identify as having a disability, but that doesn't mean that they registered for DRC services. Many students find compensation strategies that work for them, and so they push on through. Other students are hesitant about registering with us because of stigma, but we hope that's lessening. Our view is that disability is diversity, and it's not something that needs to be fixed. We want to be open to how the student perceives themselves and their disability and how they define themselves. All right, on to the next slide.
Okay, so basically, in terms of ensuring equitable access, essentially, there's three parties that are sort of responsible for ensuring the access piece. Obviously, we need the students. Obviously, we need the DRC. And then, of course, like I mentioned earlier, we do need faculty and staff as well. So for students, their responsibility is essentially to initiate the process of getting services. So at the higher education level, there is quite a bit of responsibility that's placed on students' shoulders in order to sort of ask for what they need and initiate that contact with the DRC to let us know that they need assistance. We won't know that a student needs assistance unless they reach out to us and request services and go through that interactive process with us to figure out what sort of accommodations they might need to create a more, equitable setting for them. So they have to, go through the registration process, which involves not only submitting an application to us, but they also have to provide some kind of documentation of disability or functional limitations that lets us know what they're struggling with in the campus setting. And we pick accommodations and select them, based on expertise in reviewing that documentation and figuring out, okay, what we need to do to campus to change it, to modify it in order to make it more accessible to them. So those, like we looked at the chart before, those functional limitations can vary greatly, both within disabilities and then across disability categories. So each sort of consideration is a case-by-case scenario. And so that's what we're doing on the DRC end, is figuring out, in that case, in that case-by-case, situation, what is the student going to need in class? What are they going to need in the physical setting? What are they going to need in housing or in dining? So we're exploring all different areas depending on what the person's specific needs are, and trying to sort of coordinate across campus any area where it might be impacted. And so we do rely a lot on student reporting and just sort of what they're asking for. We explore, what's possible, and beyond what's possible, what do they need? What do we already offer? What could be offered? And so, of course, there could always potentially be a grievance process, and that's why it's mentioned, at the bottom there, clarifying grievance options, because sometimes what we're providing to students may not be exactly what they were seeking or thinking in their minds, but we always make, every effort to accommodate students in the ways that they're seeking. And then if they have a problem with how we've accommodated them, they can always give us feedback on that. But usually we're pretty successful in being able to, problem solve and figure out ways to, help students in the ways that they need. And then the staff and faculty end of things, obviously, just being open to students with disabilities is huge. So doing things like having a syllabus listing that just refers to DRC students and let students know that you're willing to work with them and with the DRC can speak volumes. Obviously, we're always available to consult with instructors and with staff members regarding accommodation needs. If you're looking at an accommodation plan and you're not quite sure how to implement it, then please always reach out to us. We are there for that reason, to kind of help you to strategize and figure out how to make things work. The goal is just to try and avoid having faculty make those unilateral, accommodation decisions. We're making all of our choices based on not only our training and expertise, but a review of medical documentation and understanding of disability labels. And so there's kind of two ways that things could go. Professors try and self-accommodate. They could either give too much and essentially give a student specialized treatment beyond what's actually necessary for their disability, or they could potentially not give enough and it would be insufficient to actually meet the student's needs. So that's kind of, two parts. But then the other piece is then it's expecting the student to give up confidential information, and we never kind of want to skirt into that territory just because of protections on the student. So it's always best to just sort of defer back to the DRC. We're happy to work with faculty, of course, but don't ever feel like, you're responsible for making accommodation decisions on behalf of a student. Even if they maybe did that in the junior college setting, which we do hear quite a lot from students, like still always just refer them back to us. It's typically the safest way to go. And so we're always going to seek ways to accommodate the student unless the accommodation could potentially, fundamentally alter a course's objectives or present an undue financial burden on the university. But those are typically really, really high bars to reach. And so for the most part, you're not going to see a accommodation request rise to that level unless it's something really, really significant. But of course, if there are concerns from a faculty member about, course objective alterations or about a financial hardship, we would still explore that and talk about it.
Okay, and Danielle, can you check the chat? Because if I open it up on mine, it's going to cover up the screen share.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on it.
Thank you. And on to the laws. Okay, so you're looking at a slide now of the ADA, Section 504 and 508, the Fair Housing Act, and Executive Order 1111. All right, so lots of work to be done. We all get to be a part of the disability rights movement. Even by attending this presentation, you're supporting equitable access. So, every time we cross a barrier, we get the opportunity to remove it, and that makes it much easier for everyone that follows. So let's take these laws one by one. So the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA, that was passed in 1990. It's important to know, though, that some amendments were added, which broadened what it meant to be a person with a disability. So those amendments were passed in 2008 and active in 2009, also known as the ADA-AA. So the definition of a person with a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities or bodily functions, and there is a record or history of such an impairment, or the person is regarded as having such an impairment. And so with the passage of the amendments, it lessened the severity that needed to be proved for someone to meet this definition. So the symptoms of a disability no longer needed to be severe. They could be moderate or more in severity. Substantial is the key word. They could wax and wane. The symptoms don't have to interfere every day of a person's life. The bodily function piece, that was a huge aspect that was added with the amendments. So persons with physiological disorders such as a digestive disorder, like a disruption, is now included in this definition. So how that would play out for Cal Poly is maybe there's a student who does have a digestive system disorder that necessitates a substantial amount of time away from their daily life activities, which could include testing. So that student may be given extended testing time to account for that possibility. All right. And then if we move on to Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, we learn that the definition is the same. It is the first federal law for protection against discrimination for persons with disabilities. No qualified individual with a disability shall, on the basis of disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or otherwise be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity which receives federal financial assistance. And so one thing to know is that pretty much every school receives federal financial assistance, and Cal Poly for sure does. So we do need to follow it for Section 504 as well as the ADA. Section 508 applies to electronic materials, electronic information, video materials that are posted for students. So any website content that's electronic, it needs to be accessible. So if you think about how a student accesses that information, if they have a visual challenge, then what they need to do is use screen reading software. So we need to make sure that their software will provide them with the information that the other students are receiving. That includes photos being tagged with a description so they understand what they're supposed to be looking at. It includes captioning. One common misunderstanding is that if there is a transcript which has been AI generated, that should serve as meeting captioning needs. And that is better than not having any captions. Under Executive Order 1111 and the ADA and 504 and 508, we do need to provide captions, and that means accurate captions. So we really need instructors to do the best they can with going through those transcripts and editing them for accuracy. And then if we go down a little bit more, again to Executive Order 1111, this is the order that comes to us from the Chancellor's office. Each campus shall maintain an office to provide specialized support and services to students with disabilities and a website to provide students with disabilities with information regarding available resources and accommodations, as well as the procedure by which students may obtain these resources and accommodations. All right. And then the Fair Housing Act of 1968, same definition as the ADA, covers basic housing accommodations. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in renting. So you cannot be discriminated on the basis of a protected class. So if you have a disability, they cannot discriminate against you. They cannot discriminate against anyone on the basis of their race, religion, national origin, or sex. And something interesting to note about the Fair Housing Act of 1968, it was passed just days after the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. And it's believed that because of that devastating loss that it gained momentum and was passed. And the Fair Housing Act stands as the final great legislative achievement of the civil rights era. All right, and so it relates to Cal Poly in the sense that we do have students that need housing accommodations, such as students who need emotional support animals, which can be any animal from a spider to a snake that doesn't pose a threat to others, to a dog or a cat, and we have had all of those. Service animals, which are dogs, or in some situations where a dog won't meet the student's need, it could be a miniature horse. We have not run into that situation yet. Usually if a person's allergic to a dog, they will have a miniature horse. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some examples of housing accommodation. So we've had students that have mood disorders, and having roommates could be triggering. And so maybe those students need to have their own room. So they might be eligible for a single room if their disability substantially impacts, again, one or more major life activities. All right. So we look at the student's documentation, like Danielle was explaining, their history of need, and what can we do to give that student the same experience as other students, but without aggravating their symptoms. And that's when we would put in place some accommodations.
So regarding absences, so the accommodation, the most critical part on that is the accommodation for the absence must be agreed on by the student and their access specialist. So we're going to go over the common accommodations and some possible remedies, and know that these are always up for discussion. And as Danielle mentioned, it's fine if you have any concerns or disagreement. We just need to hear about it. And you want to be careful about letting the student know you disagree or have concerns. Oh, bless you.
Sorry, that was Brayden. I should have muted myself. My husband, everyone.
Bless you, Brayden. Yeah, you just want to bring any of those questions or concerns to us, because it may turn out that there could be an alternative way to address the situation. Maybe the accommodation that the student usually receives doesn't have to necessarily be the one, and something else could happen. So that's totally up for discussion. You just want to make sure the student doesn't feel pressure. You can tell us, very bluntly how you feel about it. We hear a lot, so that's fine. But you just want to be careful about any impression you're giving to the student. All right. So regarding missed examinations, the common remedy for that is rescheduling, right? There are some concerns sometimes about the amount of time that passes, how the student might not be able to then participate in any reviews of what the test was about and that material, or that material might have to be put off until the student's tested. There's exam security concerns. And so know that under the ADA, a professor's concern that exam information might be known to the student is not a substantial reason to deny the student the accommodation to make up the exam. So that's just something to keep in mind. But we can all talk about your concerns if the answers were released. Are there any other ways to still get at that student's knowledge and calm your concerns you have about exam security? So if the access specialist, the instructor, and the student are all in agreement, then it's good. All right, and a possibility that might come out of like such a discussion would be an alternative assignment to demonstrate that knowledge. And instructors do have that purview to test each student how they think would be best. And of course, that's going to bring up a lot of questions and concerns about fairness and such. But coming from the viewpoint of disability, we're trying to minimize the impact of that student's symptoms on showing what they know, what they're capable of. And so an instructor giving a student an oral exam versus a written, although that is a huge difference, the format is very different. If the access specialist from the DRC and the student and the instructor are all in agreement about that would be the best measure for that student, that can happen. We've also had some situations where larger tests were broken down into weekly quizzes. So things can be explored. Those are rare. They don't happen that often. And the student's disability documentation has to back up that need. So we're looking at a more severe need if you're going to be changing the format of a test. And then average, that's another way to handle this. Average pass, you could average the pass scores of the examinations or exclude the missed exam from the course grade. Now those are tricky because excluding the missed exam from the overall course grade is not equitable access compared to peers, right? Because they're missing that opportunity. So that one, it really depends on if the student's okay with that. We just really want to make sure everybody's on the same page about that. Sometimes students are, they feel like too much time has passed. They don't want to study for it. They're fine. So those are some options. A missed lab, and we do hear about this now and then, labs that are missed, and there was extensive lab setup and the lab is now torn down. So, that's a great time to reach out to the student's access specialist and try to problem solve how to still get at that student's knowledge without having to reset up the lab. If there isn't much setup with the lab, then I would really recommend you go ahead and do it because that outweighs the possibility of some future complaint with maybe the student saying that the alternative lab they were given was more difficult. And so the more you can just give the student the same examination, again, unless there's an accommodation need that makes that challenging for the student and their disability symptoms get in the way, but the more it can be the same, the better. So you just want to keep that in your mind, like, will it only take me an hour to set it up? Then that's probably the thing to do. Go ahead and set it up. Sometimes we look to ideas we've had with our students with physical disabilities and trying to think about how to recreate lab situations. So our students that have fine motor impairments, they often will dictate their knowledge to a lab partner or the instructor instead of actually handling the lab items. Visually, there may be a challenge with a student with a physical disability in accessing the lab materials and seeing them, so maybe it's put on video. And now you all have experience with putting things online, so I think a lot of the things you're doing right now might be options in the future for supporting a student that's missed a lab. So those would be great things to keep in mind because they would also work for students who missed a lab for other reasons, even if they're, there isn't a physical issue there, maybe there's depression, there's excused absence, and they're missing labs. Okay, and again at the bottom there of the missed lab area, it says average pass lab scores or exclude from course grade. That's the same as the missed examinations that we went over. Again, the student would have to be in agreement. And then extended due dates. This is a tough one because it can cause that a snowball effect where students start to get behind and then it could result in an incomplete. However, that is a reality for quite a few of our students, especially our students with psychological disabilities who may miss quite a few days of school. So it may end up pushing all of their deadlines, their whole timeline for the course out. And that is one where it would be great to reach out to the students access specialist and set up a meeting for you and the student and the access specialist to just rework those timelines. And the student should be held accountable to those new deadlines. So just the same consequences that their peer would have for missing a deadline, that's what they should receive. If there's another disability event that happens and the student's requesting for a further extension, we should all get together and talk about that because it might not be reasonable. And let's see. Yeah, sometimes we do need to look at the withdrawal process, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and we all try to avoid it, but sometimes that does make the most sense depending on the amount of material the student has missed. So that is something to keep in mind, and we're available to help go through that process and see if there's any other way to catch the student up. Another thing to think about with extended due dates, if the student is voicing challenges about meeting the new deadlines, you could look and see if there's any repetitive work, any redundant work, and consider eliminating that. The student should still be held to the same difficulty level as their peers, but maybe repetitive work could be eliminated. So then that's not getting in the way of the student moving through the course and trying to keep up or catch up. Any chat questions, Danielle? Sorry.
Yes, we just got one. So their courses often weigh participation heavily. What happens in this case if a student misses many days of class?
Could you read that again?
So their classes oftentimes weigh participation heavily.
Oh, okay.
And so they wanted to know what happens if a student misses many days of class.
Okay. And so, so the accommodation of excused absences then allows the student not to be penalized. But what we need to do then is, as Danielle said, we need to look at the fundamental expectations for that course. Has the student missed those pieces? Is it unlikely they're going to be able to recoup and continue? Have we explored all possibilities? And that's critical. So if there was ever a complaint, the courts will look at, did the instructor, the DRC, and the student get together to review all possible alternatives for helping that student catch up, for recouping that missed information? And we can think out of the box on how to do that. So yeah, what were the other chat questions?
That was it. There was only one more and I answered it in the chat, just wanting to know how many access specialists we have and the caseload size.
Yeah.
So.
And do you have anything to add to this slide, Danielle?
I think you covered it, pretty well. So I think just the biggest piece is, regarding the population of students that we're typically seeing, with these accommodations. And as somebody whose primary caseload is psychological disabilities, I would say, the vast majority of my students are all using these, particular services. And, there is a line between missing a reasonable amount of class and then it becoming so excessive that a student really does need to, withdraw from the term. And with mental health, that really can be a high likelihood during any given, quarter. So we really can't, make blanket statements, for the students because every situation is so unique and different. And there could be one quarter where a student's okay and the next quarter they're not so okay. But we really, try very hard to work closely with instructors and with students to make sure that we're understanding a class's objectives and just making sure that we're honoring, the coursework that's being put out and the expectations of the student and not undermining what the professor is trying to teach. And at the same time, holding a student responsible for expectations placed on them as a student, because we want them they need to be qualified basically in order to successfully pass their classes. And so we don't want to give them any sort of, unfair advantage in that respect. So we are, very sensitive to kind of what's going on in each situation to make sure that we're making the best choices or referring the students to the right places depending on their situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And occasionally we will have a student that, gets a little confused and feels like past precedences were set and they should be able to continue extending deadlines. And that's really when you want to bring us in because it's not really helping the student either. They're suffering by dragging things out more, and often students that tend to do that um, struggle with withdrawing from a class and having a manageable course load. So it's really good if we can all come together and help the student find a way out of that. And maybe that does involve dropping a class and being held accountable to the initial due date. And yeah, because our students try to take on so much, and it is really hard, especially if you have a disability such as depression.
So let's see. So they wanted to know if participation is related to like a role play or an experience that relies on other students, how would they make up that kind of assignment?
Do you want to take that one?
Shoot, yeah, I'm getting twisted towards my legs.
That's a tough one.
My electrical cord. Yeah, so I mean, it potentially an assignment could be modified, but it really depends on what the objective is with the assignment. So is there a way that the students still could perform the role play in another setting and still display that they have the content knowledge or the informational knowledge? So I don't know if it's like mock counseling that they're doing, or what kind of experiential role play it is, but is there a way that they could still perform without having to be around other students? Could they do it with a professor, for instance? Could they do a video recording with a friend? Does it have to be a student from the classroom? So we would really look at what the point of the activity is and what they're trying to get out of it, and if there is a way sort of to modify it. If there is truly no way to modify it at that point, we might be looking at not being able to complete course objectives. But oftentimes there are ways to modify assignments, depending on what the assignment is. So
yeah, and along with that one comes the contribution of the student to others in the class. So group work also. And so we want the student that may be missing classes to also be benefiting others with their feedback. So like Danielle said, just trying to think out of the box and looking for other opportunities that they might do that. Maybe they could meet up with a student outside of class. Maybe they could Zoom in. Maybe there could be a due date extension on that activity, so they could do that role play the next week. I do realize that pushes their partner behind, so it's possible that maybe their partner has two partners, and maybe that student gets a little extra credit. And everybody has different feelings about extra credit, but we're just trying to think outside of the box about how that student could still meet that same objective. A lot of times our students with severe depression, they do graduate, but they end up being here for like 6 to 10 years. Wouldn't you say that, Danielle? Is that?
Yeah, they can. Definitely, if there's been leaves of absence for hospitalization or treatment, or just like needing to take time off or go home and get support from family members, yeah, it can definitely take longer. Or if you're doing a reduced course load and it's just, slower quarter by quarter situation, I think both are true.
And that's with severe depression. So it really is a long haul for these students, and they want to achieve their degree. So if there are things we can do, even if they're not, what we're doing for all the other students, then you want to go ahead and do that. And if you're ever concerned about if it's fair or not, you can talk with your department heads, but also you can talk with the DRC, or we can all get together and look at that. So the main thing is to just try to think outside of the box. Was there another chat?
Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions. So there was a couple that were kind of in the same vein, just asking for specific examples. So one instructor was told that they couldn't provide extra assignments like reaction papers to make up for missed participation. So I think a few of the instructors are curious about reasonable ways that students can make up missed participation points without it being seen as penalizing.
Yeah, well, from the DRC perspective, that's fine as long as the student agrees to it and it seems equitable. Like it's not going to be more difficult than what their peers went through, thinking about the amount of time. So taking those factors into consideration, it may be that the student's disability would make that a challenge to complete as well. So that might have been why it was declined, but that's definitely a possibility, and we've had students do that. So.
And then there was another question about a specific course. So it sounds like in this class that there are role plays for every class session, and it's a very skill specific class. So the professor wants to know if, would it be undue to require other students to adjust what they're doing because they're currently working in triads, it sounds like. And the professor is saying that they don't think that it could potentially work to like make up the role play because the students are required to sort of like role play with each other.
So there's a great case, Hogan versus Ogden, and it's about students working in groups. And it turns out the instructor had assumed that the group members were having difficulty and things weren't moving along, but it turned out the group members were doing fine, and they felt their group member was contributing substantially. And I'm just throwing that out there as an example. If there's a way that you as an instructor can gently check in without outing the student that has the disability, but just check in about how things are going, because it might be that everybody's fine with it. It might be that students feel good about it. It's an opportunity to help a peer. If they don't, though, I agree with you that you don't want to make it a hardship for the students in the class, and you want them to be able to move along at the pace that they were expecting. Again, that's when I would bring us in. It might be looking at alternative ways to demonstrate their knowledge. It sounds like with that class, if it's a fundamental expectation to have that exchange, going back to what Danielle said earlier, would it work for them to have someone outside of the class, like a friend or a teaching assistant or the instructor, even just a friend, to do that role play with and write up their experience about that? Yeah, let us know in the chat if that helps, or if you want to get more specific about it.
And then there was one more question about a team-based situation where peers are evaluating contributions of one another across the whole quarter. So the class relies on peer evaluations.
Well, and Danielle, feel free to jump in. I'm thinking with that, you'd want to be careful about the rubric, and if you're giving students a rubric to evaluate each other on, and if it says attendance, and if they're evaluating on that, because if the student does have an accommodation of excused absences, you'd want to find out like how much weight they were giving to that, if they were being very concrete and lowering the score based on that. But they should be held to the same accountability level as their peers. Danielle?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to read.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know if you had anything else to add to that.
There was some confusion about the power dynamic and who's deciding about the reasonable accommodation if the student and the instructor disagree with one another.
Yeah, so that's when you'd want to bring the access specialist from the DRC in. Is that what how are you interpreting that?
I think so, because you had made a comment about something getting declined, and I think I was answering another question, or I was reading another question, so I don't think I heard exactly what you said, but there was a question about who declines it, and then I wasn't sure if that meant the alternative assignments that are being proposed. But then there's just some lack of clarity about who has the power to decide about the reasonable accommodation if there's disagreement.
Yeah, that's what I meant, the power, who has the power?
Great question. So technically the DRC has the power to say an accommodation needs to go forward if time is of the essence. And that's done to err on the side of giving the student the access, the disability access. So that's the legal perspective, but it doesn't mean that the DRC's decision on that can't still be reviewed and critiqued and possibly changed for future. But if it is regarding something that's coming up in the next day or two and a decision needs to be made, the DRC's decision should stand. We have had situations where departments have felt strongly the other way about a DRC decision, and basically what we've been able to do is come together with meetings at the last minute and work it out. So often that works. I actually can't think of a time when it didn't work. So yeah.
All right, I think we're caught up on questions, so.
Okay. So, just going over an example, because probably our students who have severe depression are the students who are missing the most amount of class. And we can see this, occurring, like they may have a week of classes they miss, which is substantial. We do give them priority registration. I forgot to add it here. And that's to support them if they have a history of missing like early morning classes because of their symptoms, then that's giving them a better chance of making it to the classes the rest of the day. So we're on our side trying to look at how can we give them the best shot at getting through this. So we also give them note-taking support. So if they miss class, they'd get notes from up here. The makeup exams, extended due dates, excused absences. We talked about reducing the amount of redundant work. There is tutoring occasionally available through the Department of Rehabilitation. And so that's something we check in with our students about. And often if the students missed classes, it would help to have some tutoring. So that's a possibility if they qualify. And then as Danielle mentioned, sometimes though a student isn't able to keep up, and it comes down to whether or not they're qualified. And it's rare, but occasionally we do have students that with or without accommodations, they can't meet the essential coursework requirements. And it is what it is. And we try to support the student. We look at, should they be taking less classes? Again, looking at tutoring. Sometimes we look at whether they should be going to a community college and trying it there for a while. But sometimes it does come down to qualified status, or students need to just take a break and prioritize their mental health, and then they can come back. There could be medication changes students are struggling with, so it may not be best for them to be here right now with the amount of stress that school brings. So sometimes a withdrawal is the best option. Danielle, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think that. I think you covered it. We're getting questions about animals in the classroom.
Oh, animals.
Yeah. So I give the thumbs up that we talk about it because that seems to always come up.
Why don't you go ahead? That's your
yeah, that's my realm.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So basically, emotional support animals typically are only going to be seen in housing. So technically, we're not allowed to say that emotional support animals are never allowed in the classroom, because if a student were to be able to prove that they needed an animal as an accommodation in order to perform their work in a class, then we would have to explore that as an accommodation. But that's never been the case at Cal Poly. We've never had a student who has an emotional support animal that they actually need as an accommodation in order to complete their classwork. So,
and that's because Danielle was able to look at alternatives for that student to comfort themselves. So thank you.
What we ended up doing is we ended up giving the student special exception registration status, and they were able to create breaks in their schedule and go home throughout the day to be with their animal if they were feeling triggered or overwhelmed, so they could like calm themselves down and still have access to I think it was a dog, even if they weren't able to have it in the classroom with them. But technically under the law, we can't ever say that they're never allowed. But in my humble opinion, if a student were able to bring an animal into the classroom, I think most of the time it is going to rise to the level of it being a psychiatric service animal, just because it's very likely if they're truly needed in the classroom for the student to be able to do their work, it's likely that the animal is performing some kind of task that's keeping the person able to be in classroom. So a psychiatric service animal would be any service animal that's performing an actual task like, pressure therapy or redirecting if the person's having a panic attack, or doing something that's, providing physical access to different spaces for that person. So we see, a lot of veterans with PTSD with service dogs, and those dogs help them to be in different spaces where maybe they wouldn't actually be able to go otherwise. So like I said, either doing something physically to the person's body or helping them to go to different spaces, let them know that they, sense that there's some kind of anxiety attack or panic attack coming, or sensing that a situation is going to be too overwhelming for the person and leading them elsewhere. So dogs can be trained to do, different things to help a person. And that's typically what you're going to see in the classroom. If the person's bringing an animal otherwise, then likely they haven't been approved for it by us if it's not on their accommodation letter. So if they tell you that they are allowed to bring it, but it doesn't say that on their letter, then maybe check with us about that. But really it comes down to that task piece. And so with animals, you're always able to ask the person, does this, animal perform a task, and what tasks does it perform to help you? And if they don't have a good answer to that question, then they probably shouldn't have the animal in your classroom. So, and then the other piece with that is that emotional support animals can pretty much be most animals that you would see in a typical household. So cat, dog, different kinds of, reptiles, small mammals, rabbits, gerbils, things like that, snakes, birds even, and service animals would be just dogs or miniature horses.
And just to add on to that, if you do have a service animal in your classroom and it's barking or is disruptive, you definitely should, as discreetly as possible, try to approach the students and say, you'll need to get your dog under control. And then if they don't, you could say you're going to need to, have your dog leave the classroom. You stay, you can stay, but your dog is going to need to leave the classroom because it's disruptive. So again, barking or wandering around a lot, anything that's, disruptive, and that can be disruptive. You can also call us. We often go out to classrooms and observe and work with students regarding expectations around service animals. And that's also when we find some are not service animals, and we have that conversation. So we're here for you on that. If you're in class and it's happening, you want to call over and then continue your class, we'll try to come over as soon as we can. It might not be right then, but if it is, I'll give you my phone number and a follow-up email, my cell, so you can always call if you're having challenges.
Do you want to speak to competing disabilities in the classroom with animals and pet dander allergies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we have had a couple situations where either another student or the instructor has a fear of dogs, or there's an allergy, a severe allergy. Oh, was there something there? I thought I heard somebody.
No.
So when it's another student, then that student needs to register with the DRC, and we will review if it is reasonable that they have an accommodation to avoid animals. We may look at seating in that classroom and whether that would be enough, and sometimes that is enough. Let's say the instructor has a phobia of dogs. Well, then they would go to HR and they would explain about they have an accommodation need that involves no one in class having a dog, and they would work with HR to get that as an approved accommodation. When we've had that situation in the past, it's usually been resolved informally. We've been able to address the instructor's concerns by having the student with the dog sit in a certain area of the classroom, and also a meeting where they're just one-on-one where the instructor can meet the dog without all the students around, and just kind of get to know the dog a little bit better. But sometimes that won't be enough, and it may rise to that level of the instructor needing accommodation. And so whenever it's competing, it's hard to know like what the solution will be. It isn't black and white. The whole situation is reviewed. Is there another lecture section the student could attend that works with their schedule? If so, that would likely be the solution. If not, then we need to look at some more creative ideas, maybe remote attendance, maybe, yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one, but yeah, you definitely want to involve HR if you're the instructor.
Okay, and then we got a couple more questions. I think probably I can answer at least some of these. So there's a question about how much time should instructors be expected to give students who need accommodations? So, with alternative assignments or different exams. So, yeah, so that one's a little bit trickier now with the virtual quarter because a lot of exams are actually going to look more like assignments. I know for some classes, if you're not doing like a Canvas or a Polylearn test that has a timer in it. So extensions on assignments are always kind of considered on a case-by-case basis. Most students only need, like 1 to 3 days, I would say, to get an assignment done, but it really depends on the situation. Are they needing an extension because of symptom severity? Are they needing an extension because of their processing speed? I mean, what's going on? And so typically that conversation would involve the access specialist and helping to sort of navigate what a reasonable time frame is, taking into consideration what the assignment is, what the expectations are, and then what the student's actual functional limitations are. So it might not be the same for every assignment. And typically my recommendation to students at the start of the quarter is to review the syllabus with the instructor and sort of have a game plan for how much time they think they might need for each assignment so that way they and the professor both have an idea moving forward of how things might go. So yeah, I mean, really involving the access specialist at that point, if there's any confusion, would be the best thing.
Or concern about the amount of your time that's being put into it. We had a situation last quarter where at first glance it looked like there would be a lot of work for the instructor, but when the instructor, the student, and I sat down, we were able to really just whittle it down and just revise some expectations, and then it ended up not changing much at all. So again, feel free to reach out to us because we've been to a lot of those type of meetings, and we might be able to bring those suggestions forward to help you out so you wouldn't have to recreate the wheel.
Yeah, and I guess I misunderstood the question. So I was reading time as like time extension, but the professor actually meant workload issues for faculty when they have a lot of DRC students in their classroom. But I think kind of the answer is almost sort of the same. If there's challenges with accommodating a student, then it's good to involve the access specialist at that point. And I mean, students are expected to communicate with their instructor regarding their needs. So everybody has to kind of play a role in communicating. And so you're not expected to accommodate a student if they're not actually requesting to use their services. So I don't know, Amy, if you have something more to add to that.
No, I think that's right. And again, if you are feeling frustrated and you feel like this is, more work than you should be doing, then definitely reach out to us and your chair, and let's look at what can happen.
Yeah, and then the only other thing, there was a question about health support for students with health impairments, and we do refer students to various on-campus and in-area resources. We don't monitor them in the sense that they are sort of responsible for their own disability at the higher education level, but if something comes up during an intake meeting or during another meeting past the intake that we're concerned about, we definitely will refer them to different resources on campus, but we do everything we can in campus setting to create accommodations so that they'll be, set up and protected and safe and all of that. So if there's anything beyond that, they would need to let us know that they were seeking, external support or extra support of some kind. But we have too many students on our caseloads to be able to like actively monitor health situations unless there's, some particular reason why we would need to, we've been communicated about. So
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask if I could follow up on the question I had posted. I was thinking about students who have, like for instance, the case of students with severe depression. And I was just kind of trying to think through, what all of our various roles are. And so I think my concern is, how do we all coordinate so that a student doesn't, slip through the cracks and like maybe like I've had students and then also just, in my personal life, knowing folks who when they become severely depressed are not following through with their health plans. And so I think sometimes as instructors, we may be the first ones to see that because they've stopped showing up for class. So I was sort of trying to think through like, how do we, work with you around that kind of situation, I guess.
That's a really good point, and you will be the first ones. So what I would recommend is that you reach out to the Dean of Students, and then they put it out to the Student of Concern team, and that's a team that meets weekly. Danielle and I are both on it, along with our director, Debbie Hill, and that's where campus partners get together, and it's the heads of each department, so it's not a lot of people, and it's very discreet. And we go over students that we are particularly concerned about, and we all review and make a plan for outreach and who's going to take on the next step and how to update the instructor and all of that. So that is out there. I do think it's helpful. Each week we get updates on how things are going for those students and how the steps worked out.
Yeah, I actually had a situation a couple years ago with a student I knew pretty well, and I was really worried about him because of a message that he had sent me. And then I did talk to the Dean of Students. They followed up, and I think did a nice job, because then when he followed up with me, he didn't seem like he felt like he'd been stigmatized or anything like that. And I think it turned out it wasn't as serious as I had worried. But yeah, I did have a good experience with them jumping on that really quickly.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I've found everybody on that team to be very respectful and gentle in approaching students. So yeah, I think it's effective. I'm glad you had a good experience.
Yeah, I think it reduces almost like the workload for the instructor, having to figure out, are they DRC? Are they using different resources on campus? Because the Dean of Students will, be able to look at all of that and figure out where the student is connected, and then communicate with the appropriate parties to make sure the student is getting, what they need from each department on campus. So I think just to, to expedite things, that's always the best way to sort of handle, those situations, I think.
Yep.
And it's better to be overly cautious than not
Yeah.
cautious enough. So
Yes. That's so true. Any other questions? We do have a couple more slides if you'd like us to go over those. You monitor the chat. I'm going to go through them because they're the common questions we get from instructors. So some of them we've kind of covered. Danielle and I just can't get enough of talking about accommodations.
it's like a dad joke.
This is a question for you all, which I'll answer. But can an instructor ask a student about their disability diagnosis in order to determine if they should allow for the accommodation of a makeup exam? So as we discussed, no, the student has to have some privacy. They have that right to confidentiality. But what you can do is reach out to the student's access specialist about any questions or concerns you have. And often instructors will ask us, well, what's the student's diagnosis? Because I think I know some strategies to help. And we cannot share about a student's diagnosis unless there's a need to know. So we probably won't share it, but what we can share and are happy to share are the student's functional limitations. And that's going to help you when thinking about strategies for the student and how they would test best. So we can explain about processing speed. We can explain about any challenges with distractions and needing a distraction-free environment, things like that. So we're happy to talk about those functional limitations. Sometimes it's a functional limitation in interacting with others. Sometimes you might have a student who maybe is saying things that are a concern or are disruptive. And so that's definitely a time when you want to reach out to us and we can give you some background and some suggestions and hear your suggestions and we can talk about possible accommodations, and then we can work with the student too to help support them, because they may not realize that what they're saying is a little disconcerting for others. So can an instructor say no to a student's accommodation request for an extended due date? So it's possible that you may be right in denying it, but you don't want to say it directly to the student. You would just say something to the effect of, you know what, I'm going to reach out to your access specialist and review the situation, and we'll bring you in on that discussion. You know, I just want to reach out to the DRC and get some more information about your accommodations. Okay? So next question, if an instructor drops the lowest test score for everyone, do they still need to allow for an exam to be made up? And that's a common one we get. We discussed that a little bit already. So yeah, you do. But again, if you have some concerns, bring those to the access specialist. So when you think about it, think about students who maybe chose to stay up the previous night to hang out with friends, right? Versus a student that had a seizure and now they're just exhausted and cognitively they cannot do the exam at 8 a.m. So that student with a disability doesn't have the choice there and they are protected. So you would have to give consideration for how that student could get that opportunity back. But again, if there's concerns, call the access specialist and we can look at some ideas there. If an instructor is concerned that a student will talk to classmates before taking their makeup exam, can they deny the accommodation? So we discussed that. The answer is no. Concerns about exam security are not a reason to deny the student. If the syllabus states all students will lose points for absences, does that include students who have an accommodation of excused absences? So we covered that one. So students with excused absences, that's different. If an instructor gives everyone extra time, do they need to provide for extended time? This one we get a lot. So we will get instructors who are trying to promote the idea of universal design and really eliminating the need for an accommodation of extended time, which is in theory great. That's what we all should be doing, trying to remove barriers and creating a space where students don't even have to ask for an accommodation, and it benefits a variety of learning needs. However, legally, a student's extended time that's been determined by the Disability Resource Center, the disability experts on campus, has to be provided, and it has to be at the very max of the last student testing in the class. So if an instructor happens to give a couple students in the class that don't have DRC accommodations additional time beyond what was expected, the student with extended time should get theirs added on after that, excuse me, as well. So although we get it, and it's you know, it's thinking about universal design, the extended time piece is legally what they're, you know, they have a right to receive. So that's one to be careful about. What might be an example of a fundamental alteration regarding extended time? And this, I have a good one. This is like how high that bar is. So there was a nursing school student who had to do a blood draw within a certain amount of time, and she couldn't do it. And she asked for extended time. And that was denied. That was seen as not reasonable because it would cause the patient discomfort. So yeah, it's rarely do we find that there is a substantial fundamental alteration to the course expectations. But we're happy to meet with you and your department head to like review that, because it's possible that there might be one. So we definitely want to respect that. Okay, the second or the third one's about exam security. We've already covered that. Does extended time as a test accommodation apply to take-home exams? So it may. It's tricky. So we ask students to involve us if there are those situations. Students do need to be proactive in requesting accommodations. They need to make their needs known in a timely way. So occasionally students may ask for extended time with take-home exams. That's when we're likely going to pull out their documentation. We're going to review it and see if that really makes sense, if that's reasonable. So that one's a little more gray. Was there a question?
No questions.
Okay. Do instructors need to be reachable for questions during exams? Yes. So unless you tell all the students in your class that you will not answer any of their questions, you have to be reachable. But what you can do, because I mean, it's understandable that a student may have double time and you're in another lecture and you can't answer their question, you can put someone else in charge of responding to their questions. So you can have a designee, and that's perfectly fine. Can a student ask to use their extended time after they've already begun an exam? No, they cannot. Accommodations need to be proactive. We have had students reach out to us about that, and we have to allow them to talk with you, their instructor, and we explain to the instructor, you would do for this student what you would do for any of your other students based on the excuse that they're telling you. Like if they say that they arrived late because they couldn't find a parking space, that's up to you if you want to allow them to have more time, but you wouldn't consider their disability status. If a student had a seizure or there was some kind of significant situation that happened while they were testing and their extended time didn't cover it, then we would reach out to you and review and get your opinion on, you know, what your thoughts are with the situation.
Okay, so what more can you do? So one great resource, and this is going to be particularly helpful given the virtual format of learning at present, is the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, which we fondly refer to as the CTLT. So through that office, they provide accessibility workshops on things like PolyLearn, which is now converting to Canvas, things like how to properly make documents accessible for students. They can also assist with things like video captioning. They provide one-on-one consultations with Pam Dougherty here on the left-hand side, who's an instructional designer and accessibility specialist. So she can help you to make your course materials accessible. They provide workshops. So one example is from spring 2019. They did an inclusive course design workshop on implementing UDL guidelines. And you can find more information on their resources at ctlt.calpoly.edu/resources. And then Pam's email and phone number are there on the left. And again, what more can you do? There is the faculty room featured here on the left-hand side. Do it, www.washington.edu/do-it. And it has case studies on what other universities have done in regards to accommodating students. So you can see a few different headers there. There's an overview, a universal design section, an accommodations section, information on rights, information with resources, and then a general knowledge base. So we have a link to this on our website under the faculty and staff resources. You can use the link here, but this is just a really great place to go with lots of general information that's not Cal Poly specific in regards to accommodations and supporting students with disabilities. Lots of people from other institutions, participate in providing information here. So a great way to become more knowledgeable. And then another thing to do is to collaborate with the access specialists in our department. So you can work with us to review student accommodations, any concerns you might have. We can do an accessibility review of your specific classroom or space. If there's a lab, for instance, and you're concerned about safety, we can go over there. If you're not sure about furniture, and so you and the access specialist and the student would kind of do a go through of the room or the space to determine what's needed. We can discuss universal design strategies with you, and that basically just means how to make your classroom more accessible to the greatest number of learners. Universal design can apply to things like learning, testing knowledge, environmental access. If you're interested in just making everybody able to learn better in your space and with your materials, then we're happy to discuss some of those things with you. And then, we love talking about disability as diversity. And so if you're ever looking to create a more inclusive learning space for your students, we always welcome those conversations as well. Please do visit our faculty web pages. Again, like I mentioned, on our homepage, drc.calpoly.edu, on the right-hand side, there's a section with faculty and staff resources. That includes things like 10 things faculty should know. There's also sample syllabus statements that you can use to refer your students to talking to you about their accommodations. And then also, like I mentioned a little bit ago in the beginning, to make students know that you're trying to create an inclusive space that accepts them. So this has the vision for the DRC Cal Poly. Oh, you add something?
Yeah, on those web pages, thank you for pointing that out, because there's a whole section on testing and videos that can train faculty on how to work with our online accommodation faculty portal where you can see all the students in your class that have requested accommodation. So in addition to getting that email, you could just pull up each of your classes and see which students have requested accommodations and what those are. So look on the DRC portal for faculty and testing, and all that's there.
So our vision is to be a universally accessible community that encourages the full participation and contributions of every member with individual accommodations needed only in unique or uncommon situations. By educating students, staff, and the community, people will come to understand that there are innumerable ways to display their genius. Climbing a tree is simply one of them. So, you know, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need the DRC, but here we are. And so it's important to just remember that it takes a village, and we really require your collaboration to make it work for students. So as much as you can understand that every student in your classroom might need something different, we're a long way to being successful and supporting, you know, student accommodations and whatever needs they have. In this image here on the right, it's a tree, and there's a little bitty fish on the bottom left-hand side, if you can see. And the quote on the tree says, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid." And that's by Albert Einstein. So looking at students for who they are as individuals and knowing that they all bring different gifts, talents, strengths, you know, unique abilities, and really allowing them to express that in the classroom without expectation for them to behave or perform a certain way. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free always to reach out to either of us or any of the other access specialists or staff. You can find my email here, djohns04@calpoly.edu. Amy's is agcode@calpoly.edu. And then our website, like I mentioned previously, drc.calpoly.edu, and our general phone line, which we are still answering during these COVID times, 805-756-1395.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and reviewing all of this. It was a lot. We appreciate you sticking around, and we hope to hear from you. We look forward to working with you all, and thank you for all you're doing to level the playing field. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Bye.